Hello and welcome, my name is Haas, and this is my top 10 games of 2016 list, the time of the year where we look back at all the hopefully great game titles that stuck with us throughout. It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, this is my completely subjective list based on the sole merit of how much a game grabbed me this year, and these are all titles that came out in 2016. Before I get into the actual list, however, I want to start with one big honorable mention that, frankly, if it were not for this aforementioned rule, would be somewhere in my top 3. That game being Heroes of the Storm. Heroes of the Storm is of course Blizzard's MOBA, in which characters from all their franchises battle it out over a number of different maps. The game officially released in 2015, but I had been playing it ever since the alpha stage in 2014, and ever since then I had enjoyed it, although I thought it was a rather flawed game. As I can't point to any specific patch or expansion they've released thus far, I will simply put it here as a big honorable mention, as Heroes of the Storm has had a fantastic year and has improved tremendously in 2016, with the addition of numerous new heroes, old hero upgrades, finally a competitive banning system, and a lot of smaller quality of life upgrades to the point where I absolutely love the current version of Heroes of the Storm. It is a fast MOBA that gets right into the action, shakes things up constantly depending on which map you are playing on, has plenty of interesting hero designs, and although the point of entry is relatively low for a MOBA, it is certainly a game that takes a lot of mastery at the higher levels. Throughout 2016 they've done a solid job adding new interesting heroes and maps, made a lot of the less frequently picked secondary ultimates viable, all the while doing a good job at balancing the game. Very recently they've added Ragnaros as a new hero, which was well out of balance the first few days, but within 6 days they've managed to get him back in line. The only element they've added and changed so far that I am not too fond of is the return of the Haunted Mines map, and even then they've seemed to made it far superior to what it used to be. But currently, especially when one team has Sylvanas, it seems too one-sided, but I digress. Let's not drift off about the current meta. Again, this is without a shadow of a doubt an honorable mention equal to my top 3 in the upcoming list. With that being said, let's get right into the actual top 10 games of 2016. At number 10, Grim Dawn. Grim Dawn is the spiritual successor to one of my favorite games of the past, Titan Quest. Certainly, Grim Dawn is rough around the edges, but that doesn't take away from it being one of the better action RPGs out there. It paints an image of a world ravaged by supernatural forces, a nitty-gritty universe in which your task is mainly murdering it all, and sometimes that's just what you want out of your game. Like Titan Quest before it, you build your character based on 2 sets of talent trees, with the new addition of a devotion system that basically functions as a third tree to pick from, and this creates quite a good amount of different build possibilities for you to experiment with. It's certainly far from perfect, it starts off rather slow, and in general it runs into pacing issues where it takes just a tad too long to give you newer enemies to fight, the plot is rather poor, but despite it all, Grim Dawn definitely knows what an action RPG should be like, with enjoyable combat throughout, a great deal of enemies to fight, plenty of character routes to take, and of course, a great deal of beautiful loot. At number 9, World of Warcraft Legion. I have played a lot of World of Warcraft in the past. It has had its tendrils solidly in my mind ever since it first released in 2004, and from that moment on I've tentatively been interested in every expansion they've come up with, but most of them never managed to hold my attention and simply made me long for days now gone. Warlords of Draenor, for instance, was an expansion I really grew to hate and fast, and it made it all the more refreshing then how Legion ended up as a really solid expansion that I still spend a good month or 2 on non-stop playing and leveling. PvP is no longer gear-based, 5-man dungeons having a lot more interesting scaling with Mythic Plus, and the leveling path is far less linear than before. The result was clearly enough to keep me interested for quite a long time compared to previous expansions, and although it's far from the vanilla or Burning Crusade days where I practically never left my monitor, the fact that I poured so much time into Legion to begin with is something definitely worth a mention on my list. At number 8, Civilization 6. Civilization kind of has it rough in the sense that it is its own biggest competitor. Everything Civilization 6 does and tries to do has to hold up and compare favorably to Civilization 5, which after its expansion sets is simply such an incredibly good game. And Civilization 6 more than managed to plant its feet in the ground as a really competent base game. The biggest change Civilization 6 makes is in the form of the new districts mechanic, and what an excellent mechanic it is. It plays incredibly well into the core exploitation and planning philosophies that make Civilization so great to begin with, all the while resulting in a much more interesting visual spectacle. The AI is far from optimal and the UI, at least at launch, had a lot to be desired, but ultimately Civilization 6 provides a great title to sink your teeth into for those of us with many hundreds of hours already into Civilization 5, all the while setting the stage for a game that might actually overshadow its predecessor given time. At number 7, Battlerite. With Battlerite, I basically break my own unwritten rule of not including early access titles in this super important list, which I haven't done in the past simply because most of them, logically, felt incomplete and could very well change dramatically over the course of their development. That said, not mentioning it here would simply feel wrong, as I've spent far too much time already in what is basically a bite-sized MOBA of sorts. It has been completely distilled into a title all about skillful fighting, and it does it so well. Essentially a reiteration of the 2011 game Bloodline Champions, Battlerite is all about precision, understanding your and your enemy's heroes, and quick reflexes, and it executes this simple premise very well thus far, with clean visuals, a lock on healing so it doesn't spiral out of control, a slowdown on movement when attacking to prevent kiting, and many more smart mechanics. Already I've spent over 40 hours on Battlerite, and I very much look forward to the final product in 2017. At number 6, Darkest Dungeon. Darkest Dungeon easily would win my most atmospheric Game of the Year trophy. It oozes style from every pore, the visual direction is fantastic, and the narrator is incredibly intimidating and wonderful to listen to. Simply put, Darkest Dungeon has a masterful art direction. Meanwhile, it manages to make positioning an important factor, makes you care about your characters, and stress out about the very real possibility of permanently losing them to whatever abomination you might face next, and offers up solid enemy variety and class differences. Truly, it allows for a great variety of team compositions to face the darkness with, whether it's your dark arts dabbling occultist, your cutthroat highwayman, or initially brave crusader, they all offer viable, different playstyles. Playstyles you then have to adjust for as your confident heroes become increasingly less so through the acquisition of stress-induced problems and troubles. This especially is where the Lovecraftian themes really meld together well. It's not without its own flaws, it's a grind through and through, and even though I am not one to quickly shy away from that, it does surpass its limits. For the most part, the grind is made highly enjoyable through the heavily sinister, interesting atmospheric experience, with your own constant worrying, and that is really all kinds of delightful, but near the end it does overstep its boundaries, as you have to complete the final dungeon 3 times, for example. Nevertheless, if you're not too worried with desperately reaching the finale, Darkest Dungeon is easily one of the best games to pick up from this year. At number 5, Tyranny. Tyranny has created a very interesting world in which evil itself has triumphed as you play as a servant of the mighty overlord Kairos, and you can continue to dispense his or her oppressive behavior in numerous wonderful shades to your own liking. And to be honest, a large part of why Tyranny makes this list, let alone number 5, is simply because at its core it is a solid CRPG, and I am a tremendous sucker for CRPGs. They are far and beyond my favorite video game genre, and for Obsidian to have made 2 solid CRPGs in 2 years is something I greatly appreciate. That all said, there is a lot wrong with Tyranny, and the RPG fanatic in me is frankly disappointed by a number of these elements. I suppose it says a lot that Pillars of Eternity, Obsidian's previous CRPG that runs on the same engine and is very similar in a lot of ways, would have been, without a doubt, my number 2 game of 2015, if I had made that list. For Tyranny to barely make the top 5 is then really quite a shame. It suffers in places severely, it completely lacks enemy variety or difficulty through the absence of any real resource management mechanics, and this builds up to create a rather disappointing final few hours. Nevertheless, I really like the game. As disappointed as I am in some of its elements, I'm just as enthusiastic about others. Tyranny, if anything, sets the bar incredibly high when it comes to introductory experiences in CRPGs. It's easily one of the most notable CRPG starts, and the first number of hours are an absolute joy to go through, as the title doesn't treat you like a weary adventurer who gets bombarded with exposition, but instead cleverly handles the fact that you are a force of authority in this universe and are here to deal with rebels who dare defy Kairos in any way you see fit. Furthermore, the competent way it deviates into 4 different narrative experiences is something truly commendable. I wanted so much more from Tyranny, and yet I liked it more than most games this year, and it will stay with me as a memorable experience. Obsidian, please keep doing what you're doing, as I can't wait to see where all of this will be taken next. At number 4, Atlas Reactor. Another multiplayer PvP game, but quite a unique one at that. Atlas Reactor is a turn-based team tactics title in which you are joined by 3 other players and must plan and predict your way to victory in a very short window of 20 seconds. Interestingly, the game can be played for free or unlocked fully with a one-time purchase, and initially I played this completely free without any real noticeable downside, and after purchasing it, I certainly had no regrets. In Atlas Reactor, you pick a freelancer, hero champion, whichever semantics you wish to use. You can then customize them ever so slightly, but certainly significantly, and are paired up with other players to see which team can kill the others the fastest. Or rather, can kill the other team most efficiently, as you need 5 kills to win, and every dead player respawns after a few rounds. The name of the game then is Prediction. Being able to predict where an enemy is going to move, especially if you are a more close-range freelancer, predicting where an enemy will use a dash, or predicting when they will use their ultimate abilities is of utmost importance in Atlas Reactor. And when you finally wrap your head around its systems, it certainly isn't the smoothest introduction, it is so satisfying when you make a real impact in combat. Ultimately, Atlas Reactor doesn't do a lot, but it does what it does very, very well. And I found myself quickly addicted to playing this title when it first came out. A very unique, highly competent PvP experience. At number 3, Path of Exile Ascendancy. Ascendancy is technically the 4th expansion of Path of Exile. Path of Exile being a game that I've been an enthusiast about ever since I jumped into it during the closed beta. In fact, it was my game of the year when it released in 2013. And then I didn't play the game for a very long time after. Time they certainly spent well, as Path of Exile, like its players, never stopped moving and has been expanded upon time and time again with patches and bigger expansion packs like Ascendancy. In fact, since Ascendancy released, a 5th expansion pack has already been added, but for me, most of my Path of Exile experience this year was during the Ascendancy release. Immediately, I yet again fell in love with the skill tree and tremendous amount of character build options. Ascendancy then introduced Ascendancy classes, subclasses in effect, that at first I wondered if they would make builds more limiting, but ultimately didn't feel restricting to me at all, and increased my enjoyment of what I already believed to be an excellent title. Ever since it released, Path of Exile has been, without a doubt in my mind, the best action RPG since Diablo 2. And seeing that it stayed the course throughout these years, staying incredibly customer friendly, added content onto content to expand its build and playstyle possibilities, I often wonder why I even play other games at all every time I jump into it for a weekend or so, as I am yet again theory crafting my character's next build while grinding for whatever new uniques they've added ever since. In fact, at this very point I'm already behind on the next big pile of content they've added since. Truly a wonderful title that, 3 years later, is still a no-brainer for any action RPG enthusiast. At number 2, Overwatch. Overwatch is in a bit of an odd place for me, as it is so solidly in my mind as a 2015 game. After all, I spent countless hours playing the game back during its closed beta last year, and essentially continued playing it from that point on until its eventual release this year. Non-stop, I should add. From the very moment that I jumped into this Blizzard shooter, I was hooked. There's some cheap Brodog puns here, but I'll leave it be. There's certainly a lot to be said that Overwatch came out in 2016 and has clearly made such a big impact, considering it's far from the only AAA shooter to release this year. Between Battlefield 1 and Titanfall 2, Overwatch is the only one that really stuck with me. No matter how much I liked Titanfall 2, every shooter demand I found myself having was easily filled by Overwatch. Be it the pleasure I had sniping enemy healers, the joy I found in quickly darting around a battlefield, or tactically using my abilities to save my team from incoming damage, Overwatch has managed it all. Every class is incredibly distinct. Obviously Tracer is different from Widowmaker, but no singular tank is like the other either, with D.Va and Winston having very different roles and playstyles. Moreover, the amount of polish Overwatch has is absolutely second to none, and I can't think of any other game this year that has managed to succeed in so many of its elements so competently with little to no glaring flaws. The sound design is fantastic. Every ultimate is distinct, footsteps are different and reveal which enemies are around you. The point of entry is very low, and yet no hero lacks for mastery capabilities, with a very clear difference between experienced players and rookies. Again, all the while keeping the individual heroes varied. Really, the only glaring flaw I could point to were the issues the first competitive season had, such as the horrible coin flip mechanic they used for sudden death, and they have moved on since. All in all, Overwatch is a game that simply shows quality at every corner. From the excellent sound design to the immense detail in maps or various playstyles, it is certainly no wonder it ended up as such a big hit, and rightly so. This is an instance where I think the overwhelming fandom of this title is more than deserved. Oh, except those loot crates, those gamble boxes are horrible and bad and should stay away. And finally, at number 1, Total War Warhammer. I have a confession to make, and that is that I really like Warhammer. Well, actually, the confession is that I've never played a Total War game before until Total War Warhammer came out, and as such, this completely came out of the left field for me. Certainly at the start of 2016, I never thought Total War Warhammer would be my number 1 title, but here we are. In fact, after I found myself thoroughly enjoying Total War Warhammer as much as I did, I went back to check up on older Total War games, and what I found was simply that I wanted to play more Total War Warhammer. It's a game that is basically all about giant siege battles, and with that in mind, Warhammer is such an obvious pick of a setting, and they pulled it off very competently. I think the title is certainly very flawed. I suppose it's not called Total Diplomacy for a reason, and like most games in the genre, the AI is often shocking, but that does not take away from the fact that I was completely gripped this year with Total War Warhammer. The variety among races is great, they each feel very distinct and look great both on and off the battlefield, the RPG elements to the legendary lords work very well, and watching a group of minotaurs plow through a row of infantrymen never gets boring. It's a little steep to get into all the DLC packs, and the Chaos faction being so dull and bad as it is basically a crime, but the fact that you fight every DLC race in the campaign regardless of whether you have the DLC or not is a great band-aid to deal with this situation. Again, it's certainly not without its flaws, such as agent spam, but Total War Warhammer has been an absolute joy from start to finish in those 200 hours I played, and came as a complete surprise to me to begin with. Of all the games that I played a significant amount of in 2016, I can confidently say that this ended up grabbing me the most for the longest period of time, and with that, it's my number 1 game of the year. So with that all being said, thank you for sticking with me, and I hope you had plenty of games you enjoyed in 2016 as well. I do want to mention, lastly, Witcher 3, or more specifically the Blood and Wine expansion pack. Mainly, I did not get around to playing this for a significant amount of time yet, and as such it is absent from this list. A crime really, as from what I've seen of the expansion rivals the base game, and as such would be a real contender for top 3 this year. Witcher 3, on that note, definitely was my number 1 game of 2015. Alas, I didn't see enough of Blood and Wine for it to make this list, but I suppose the likelihood of it being an honorable mention in 2017 is now very high. Again, my name has been Haas, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good 2017 to come. At least when it comes to games, we have plenty to look forward to, I think.